If you're only looking inside your own sector for best practice examples, you are going to look like everybody else. I think of that as the equivalent of what we call navel gazing, trying to look at your belly button. Even if you can get your head down there and look at it, there isn't much to look at. So if you're only going to look for best practice in retail, I think you'll be doing yourself a disservice. You have to look outside to see what else is going on. So I will give you examples both from inside the retail space as well as outside. Let me get started, and I will just turn to my slides. So the title of this book, this presentation is actually based on a book of mine that is forthcoming shortly with Harvard Business School Press. So I'm again sharing with you kind of my ideas that I have discovered as we go along. Okay, so I realize that, here in Brazil, things have not been so badly hit as they have been in the United States with the current recession. It's been very, very tough, as you must have read and seen, I'm sure. So one of the questions we've been asking is, what happens to companies in down markets? What happens to companies? And it's interesting, if you look in the last 100 years, there actually have been about 10 to 12 recessions, depending on how you define a recession. So for me, the interesting question was, what actually happens? Because there's a lot of what I would consider unsatisfactory ideas being put forward about, companies, people going out there speaking as experts on recessions, and what companies should do with no data, no facts, nothing. So as a researcher, I prefer to kind of ground my ideas in actual research. So I said, let me look at companies in these recessions. What happens to them? And what is interesting is, looking across recessions, what you see is roughly the following split. You see a 60-40 split, first of all. 60% of companies survive through recessions. 40% do not. And not that they fail. Out of the 40%, some get acquired, some go private, some have other kind of alliances and merger and cross-equity holdings. But roughly about 60% of companies come out of recessions looking the way they were. Now what's interesting about this 60% is the following. Out of this 60%, about 6% are what I call breakaways. By breakaway, I mean that they come out of the recession much stronger than they were going into the recession. They actually use the down market to try to get ahead. So it's interesting, right, that most companies in recessions are going into survival mode. How can we survive this recession? How can we manage? How can we make it? These people are not just thinking of survival, they're thinking of success. So I'm in Brazil, so I must use a football metaphor, a soccer metaphor here, is that it's like the Germans who play only defense, right, versus the Brazilians who like to play offense, right? So many companies go into this German defense mindset, and they forget about offense. Now, let me put it to you another way. If you look at, so I looked over the last 100 years to see how frequently do companies jump ahead of their competition. And again, what we find is that the likelihood of jumping ahead of your competition is much higher in down markets than it is in up markets. When the market is growing, expanding fast, it's very hard to grow and jump ahead of your competition. It's when the market is shrinking, when there is adversity, when there is much tougher times, that's when you see companies, the smart ones, jumping ahead. So my first question to you is, ask yourself, are we thinking offense or are we thinking defense? Are we thinking about how we might be able to leverage this environment we are in today to get advantage? Are we doing that? And I can just submit to you, at least in the United States, most of the companies I go to, they quickly fall into defense. So that's kind of a starting point. Now the next question is, what do these guys do? Is it this way? Okay. So if you look at what do these guys do, it's interesting. You know, one is to simply say that, okay, they're doing the usual thing, they streamline operations, they chase demand, they're cutting costs and operating for efficiency, they focus on their core business, they stay the course, avoid rash